the ontology of pandemic.
Okay, we're good then, I think.
So the motivation to look into the topic surfaced shortly at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, but much more so since early 2022, when the severity of infections were down compared to earlier. And then the question generally also in popular media was raised, okay, when will this pandemic be over? Yeah. And the second question then was like, well, but how do we do that actually for any pandemic anyhow? To be able to determine that, you actually need to know the definition of pandemic so that you can assess for a particular instance whether and classify it, whether it is an instance of pandemic or it is not. And from there, what are the properties that actually have to be satisfied for something to be a pandemic, and what sort of entity it is. So to answer these questions, I first looked at and examined ontologies that contain pandemic in the hope that there was already an answer for that. And the same way, we're looking at domain experts' knowledge to see what is their definition. And from there, I had to proceed to a more detailed ontological analysis. And that analysis consisted of two components on how to align it to a foundational ontology, or to characterize it to be of what type of entity, and digging further into each of those 8 asserted characteristics of pandemics. So for the existing ontologies, I selected them from the bioportal on a search for a pandemic. Some of them were false positives, like a class that was called product delay due to pandemic, which obviously doesn't tell us anything of what a pandemic is. And some were actually rather word lists rather than an ontology. This left 9 relevant ones, and for each one of them, I checked 3 things. First, how does a pandemic relate to an epidemic? What are its subject domain parents? And what is the domain independent ancestor? The results are discussed in the paper and summarized here in the table, where the VIDO and the CIDO have the same values as the IDO there. And so they are not included there in the table, but they are properly included in the overall analysis. Mostly, pandemic is either a subclass or a sibling of epidemic. The subclasses is motivated by the informal definition, in that a pandemic is a large epidemic. And that large qualifies it to presumably make it a subclass. The domain-specific parent type is rather messy, and neither can be ontologically right. For instance, pandemics ideally do have to do something with a medicine that helps stemming the tide, but it does not mean that a pandemic is a medicine. And likewise for infections. Surely it is related, but not that each instance of a pandemic is an instance of infection. Regarding the top-level category, if anything, this is not always asserted, but if it is, then it's either a process or an event. The information then from domain experts provide a little more information, although none of them really has a good definition beyond pandemic being a large epidemic. WHO does not provide a definition, but instead has a table with descriptions of 6 phases of pandemics, where post-pandemic means that the costs and care and deaths are at the deemed to be acceptable level of the yearly seasonal influenza. This is not to say that experts haven't tried to come up with more features and more tighter definitions, such as it having to be a new disease and clarifying as to what amounts large. The most comprehensive list is described in the paper by Morans and co-authors, which I will return to later into more detail. So, with these imprecise notions, can foundational ontologies assist in a way, somehow? 7 were selected based on having documentation to figure out what's really going on in the ontology, an implementation in some logic like an OWL file, different ontological commitments that may have an effect in where it could be classified, and ideally also assistance in categorizing an entity. And 2 that have decision diagrams for that are Dolce with D3, the Dolce decision diagram, and BFO with the BFO classifier. The other ones selected were Boro, which is specifically the only one of them is a perdurantist, general foundational ontology, Sumo, suggested uppermost ontology, unified foundational ontology, and Yamato for that. So to illustrate this notion of support, you can see here a screenshot of the Buffer classifier in action, where at the middle section here is the current question and the answer option when you click on the drop down box. The already answered questions are in the history section, and at the bottom you see the subsumption alignment axiom at that stage in answering the question. For BFO, in the end, if you go through the whole decision diagram, it indeed ends up as a pandemic being a process. For Dolce, the question series ends at accomplishment, which is a subclass of event that in turn is a perdurant. For others, it was actually a lot harder to establish, but conservative alignments are also either of the two. It's either a process or a process that has an end to it, like event. For the ones where it is a process, it's mainly because event or something like it is absent from the ontology, and it is not clear whether that was just an omission or whether that was intentional by the developers of the foundation ontology. On the other side of the matter, sometimes it's not clear which of the sub-entities fits best. That can have three key different reasons. One is the lack of insight into pandemic itself, like for Yamato, or whether it would be an intrinsic or an extrinsic accomplishment. It could be the lack of clarity on the foundational ontology side, like with GFO, it could be either action or process, it's not entirely clear. Because in a way you could say in GFO it may be unspecified. The other option, as with Sumo, yeah, there are just too many options in a way. There were so many processes defined there that are more like on domain level, or some of them even. So with Sumo, you know, there is a process that's called causing unhappiness. And I think, well, yeah, that kind of qualifies for COVID, the pandemic. And for any pandemic probably as well. You also could say, well, maybe it's a natural process and how to model that and on which one best to align it to. Other observations are that the alignment process with tooling took only like 1 or 2 minutes, whereas the other foundational ontologies, the alignment process took much, much longer, many hours reading papers and analysis, going backwards and forwards to try to figure it out. And whether that's a surprise or not, actually consulting more foundational ontologies did actually not give more insight into the category of a thing that a pandemic may be. So, be that as it may, let's look in more detail at those asserted properties of pandemics that are certain kind of events occurrence. They were collected in a literature review by Morens, Volkers, and Forsey, and yes, that is that Forsey from the same Forsey from the CDC. And they are listed here on the slide. And the first interesting aspect to note is some of the imprecision, like the wide geographic extension, the high attack rate, and how severe would the severity have to be to account for a pandemic. So generally there are those fuzzy, vague, or imprecise properties, and if they are to be used to determine what is and is not a pandemic, they have to be made more precise. For instance, is the wide one whole continent? Is it two? Is it all of them? Perhaps except Antarctica. However specified, they will cause multiple optima on the event being classified as a pandemic, as well as when the pandemic will be over. So there can be different points to determine when it's over. So a second observation then is that there are a few dependencies amongst those properties. Like if it's contagious, then it's necessarily infectious. Novelty generally comes with low levels of immunity because it is novel, so your immune system doesn't know, hasn't seen it before. Also, most of the properties effectively amount to compound properties. So for instance, if you look at attack rate, it relies on the disease, the infectious agent, and the R number. And the R number relies on things like the social dynamic of a population, the ability to collect accurate data on infections and deaths, and things like dispersion parameter, like, needing super spreader event of a certain size or something like that. Just to illustrate that even that underlying imprecision, for instance, if we take, for instance, South Africa's excess deaths, as is shown here in the graph, they are overall 330,000 something, of which around 300,000 have been attributed to COVID. Whereas if you look up COVID-specific trackers, they get to about 1/3 of that. It doesn't matter which you consult, they all get to about 100,000. So, of course, when you know the ballpark figures of the imprecision, this can be factored in. And therewith making perhaps the R number less imprecise, and therewith making the attack rate more precise. But basically, you have imprecision upon imprecision in the whole sequence of that. So it's going to be hard to actually get rid of the fuzzy properties and defuzzify them. Another one is severity. For instance, one could use values for influenza, such as WHO's below seasonal threshold, low, moderate, high, and extraordinary. Or you also could dig deeper, also with the WHO. They have what is called a PISA, being the Pandemic Influenza Severity Assessment. Also, that one uses attendant properties like the transmissibility, the impact, such as the effect on hospitalizations, disease severity, and all of that counts as an input to compute the actual severity, or basically they are the things that make up severity. So that is also is an inherent imprecision even before you get to the ballpark figures like below seasonal and low, moderate, and high. That brings us then to the fourth general observation also. These properties of pandemic are ontologically actually not a property of pandemic, but more so of attendant entities that are involved in it. So key bearers are, among others, the infectious agent, like for the attack rate. The property of being infectious also is due to the infectious agent itself, or things, whichever. And geographic extent is about where the disease is being observed. In that regard, it's more like a constellation of properties for pandemics rather than of pandemics. Also, some are more important than others, on being mandatory or even essential or not. For instance, contagiousness, that was listed in the paper as a property of pandemics, and contagiousness means when it's person-to-person transmission. But the plague, well, was a pandemic, and that's transmitted via rats. So it transmitted, it has to be, but not necessarily contagiously. So therefore, it didn't have on requirements and for no. More of these details are described in the paper. The question then becomes, after this informal analysis, okay, how are we going to formalize it? This entails choosing your logic. Should it cater for fuzzy properties? Should it also address any temporal aspects, such as to capture the disease movement in time, or possibly also the pandemic stages? Which modeling style are you going to use? Something more like conceptual data modeling with data properties, such as you see there, with the infectiousness being a Boolean, yes or no, or a more elaborate representation, like that a pandemic is caused by an infectious disease that in turn is caused by an infectious agent, and an infectious agent being an agent that infects an organism. Well, it has the disposition to infect an organism, which would add additional axioms further to the formalization to that. And whether to embed that into some ecosystem of ontologies or tools as well. So each have their pros and cons. For presentation purposes, I wanted to nicely visualize the different bits and pieces in one readable figure so that it also fits nicely on one slide. So here it goes. Here is that sketch. This does not at all imply any commitment to a more applied style of modeling, but just to get the gist across. Those things in rusty color, for instance, indicate inherently imprecise properties rather than actual values of data properties. And unclear cardinality constraints there with those question marks. And because it also depends on how you're going to determine your geographic regions, for instance, and your continents. There are different continent models. So adding disease and infections agent, what you see there on the left, or for instance, transmission there on the right, is to show that there are tightly related entities, which one also could do, for instance, for the property summarized there, like attack rate, disease movement, or severity. And others, like the species of an organism that are in the pandemic, that are affected by the pandemic, sustain the pandemic. Then I took the liberty to use temporal ER notation from the modeling language in this sort of like UML-like diagram. And you can see that with the clocks on the entity types to indicate they are temporal entities, and this notion of dex and def. Dex means dynamic extension, and with a dotted arrow going from epidemic to pandemic means that an epidemic may also turn into a pandemic. And the def going back with the solid line that eventually, whenever we have a pandemic, it must return to epidemic stage, and there it possibly also endemic. I'm not mentioning the endemicity here further. So to conclude, then, pandemic is an event whose properties are combined from properties of related things, such as disease. And some of the properties are imprecise without any prospect of becoming crisp. That sort of imprecision hampers defining what a pandemic really is, and therewith also when exactly it can be called over. And that's inherently a problem to it. At least now we know better why this is the case. Foundation ontologies helped only to a limited extent, and consulting any two seems to suffice to get a good enough idea of the category of thing, and truly greatly simplified that activity. Future work includes domain ontology development of just pandemics, and with all its entities that it uses, both to clarify it further and possibly to assist with, for instance, building solutions and the simulations to model interactions to get further insight into pandemics. The references of the slides, there are many more in the paper, and thank you for your attention. I made the presentation slightly shorter than permitted because it's a pre-recorded one and interaction is more interesting in that regard. So I'm available live in the Q&A session and happy to take comments and feedback, and you also can drop me an email or leave a comment in the conferencing software. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria, and thank you all. Maria, I'm gonna pin you on the screen, and now so everybody can feel like you're in here. Thank you so much for your presentation. And our set of talks are going a little over, so I'm not going to take too many questions, but it's just like how the pandemic went. It created a bunch of problems that we had to find a solution for, and then it lasted a little longer than we would like. But I'm looking at the audience to see if there are any hands here. I actually have a question. I don't see any. Do you have a question? Okay, go ahead. You go ahead, because it's only one question today. John Beverly, who was talking just a minute ago, has a question.
Hi, Maria. I just wanted to so I was fortunate enough to review this paper, and what do you say? Talk louder. I was fortunate enough to review this paper, and you convinced me to look more closely at the pandemic epidemic literature and convinced me that the IDO representation of it was incorrect. So I just want to say thank you. All right, your turn, guys.
Thank you. Yeah, I was considering putting it in the presentation, but yeah, it's I don't know if people want to know what that one was about, or it. Thank you. Are you going to update the IDO on that one then, and consequently the VIDO and the CIDO?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
That's awesome. And yeah, I thought that it was great that you encouraged us to take a step back and really see what makes a pandemic. So thank you again so much.